building that trust with your audience, knowing that you're having a conversation today that will be supported tomorrow or a week from today or a month from today, whatever the consistency and sustainability allows for. That nurturing of conversation builds to credibility.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
What's up, podcaster? It's your host, Adam Adams. And today I've got Vinnie Potestivo on the podcast. He's been in show business for a long time, it sounds like, for I don't know. Am I allowed to say 30 years or do I have to undercut it a little bit?
When I realized my first internship was when I was a junior in high school, 1994. And man, media has changed since then. I wear that as a badge of honor.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. He's got a podcast called I Have a Podcast. And on top of that, he's got a TV show called I Have a Podcast on TV. And on top of that, he sold a podcast back in, I think it was 2006. So I want to get that part of the story first.
Yeah.
Vinnie, tell us about, did you buy and sell a podcast? How did this work? How did you buy it? What were the details there?
Oh, yeah. Cool. Long story short, I'd worked at MTV from 1998 to 2007 and became one of the first talent development executives there. So creating shows around personalities and taking that 30-second time slot on TV and giving it to a story versus a music video. So for all y'all who are mad that MTV lost the videos in room for storytelling, guilty as charged. So I'm gonna put my hands up. Punk'd, the Osbournes, Newlyweds, Run's House. I mean, these put MTV on a global position in storytelling. And I helped MTV franchise out their talent development department. But in 2006, which is when podcasts are really, as a creative media form, starting to bubble up and percolate, mostly because, to be honest, in 2006, you needed access to a microphone. So a lot of celebrities, DJs, music experts, a lot of people adjacent to celebrities or had a foot in the door in entertainment who had access to a microphone, interns at a radio station who stayed late at night. I mean, I know so many people who would do anything just to be around that microphone. And Fat Man Scoop and his wife developed a show called Man and Wife. It was a sex talk show by a married couple. And you're talking to a guy who watched sex education on MTV in the form of Dr. Drew Pinsky and Adam Carolla making jokes about every step along the way of sex. And for an LGBTQ man myself, I didn't necessarily identify to the types of sex and sex issues that were happening on that show. And I thought, who's ever had a sex advice talk show with a married couple that are committed and open-minded? She was certified to talk about sex ed. He was in the industry and was creating beats that led to needing the education for sex ed. It just seemed like the perfect blend.
You mean he was creating beats? Like he was creating music that was...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Fat Man Scoop. He's the guy. You got a $100 bill, put your hands up. You got a $50 bill. That's Fat Man Scoop. And so much more, by the way. I hate to truncate someone's career into a single hook, but that's the hook you heard and you know for sure. It was him, the go-to DJ for so many artists. And here he was just unabashedly talking about sex. Like, again, I talk about the access of microphones. Scoop and his wife went into the radio station. They recorded it late at night. It was in a booth. It was very sterile. I'll never forget it. They were so proud to share this with me. And my first reaction was like, y'all are talking about sex. And I believe this conversation is organic and true and would even happen if we weren't in the room. Even if the cameras weren't going, this would happen. But I don't believe you would go into a soundproof room to have this conversation. I kind of wish you brought the mics home and you did it on your bed or in your house, it created a more intimate experience for us. Cause you're a couple. You could give so much more than just two hosts who are put together in a studio audience to talk about sex in a very sterile way. Again, he had access to equipment. He was shooting music videos for Mariah Carey and the biggest artist. He's literally showing up with equipment. So we went to his house and we shot in the living room, the kitchen, the bedroom, and the bathroom. It sounds like a real Newlywed tour there. And we landed in the bedroom. It was magic. I brought that recording to MTV. MTV passes on the concept from development. I walk it downstairs to MTV.com and I said, look, this is a big podcast. Podcasts just got added to the iPhone. I see a trend here in where this is going. I was trying to put on a podcast talent show. Long story short, I got MTV.com to invest in building the website. They put $100K into that podcast to actually give it the presence. And then I went back upstairs and I was like, oh gosh, what did I do? We invested $100K into this website and production passed on the show. I guess Fuse or BET or U2, I guess someone else is going to end up doing the show that we're investing in. And sure enough, they were like, well, let's give it a second shot. Let's look at it. Let's see what it really is and what it could be. And that was the first time I converted a podcast into a broadcast show. I realized the power in us as individuals creating IP. I could tell you so many versions of shows that we've seen. Wild 'N Out, for example, where Nick Cannon put so much of his money into developing that tape even after MTV passed on it. Then he went back in to retool it so he can show us what he was talking about. And we own that. MTV owns that concept. In my decade at MTV, I empowered them by sharing and really telling their story. When I realized they had the opportunity to own it, especially because of podcasting, because we have the ability to create IP, intellectual property that we own, that I can then take to a network and license it and franchise it, as opposed to sell it and give it up and hand it over, which is how IP in the publicly traded market in America works. I was hooked. And if I can help more business owners create content they own, if I can help more talent brands step in and create content that creates more opportunities for them, then I truly believe this world will be a better place. And we're no longer waiting for the approval of people to make change, because we now have the ability to make change because of technology, to be really blunt.
What do you mean, Vinnie, by you turned a podcast into broadcast? What does that mean? What's the definition there? What are you saying is happening?
So as a media platform, so the difference between media and content you actually listen to, media is where it's listened to. So I took an intellectual property that lived in podcasting, audio only, and I developed it into an original TV series, leveraging the existing IP of Man and Wife, the podcast, and then turned that into a television show. So the podcast was still intact, very much so. And then in addition to the podcast that was being served, there was a television deal and ultimately a 10-episode order that MTV and MTV Networks was creating.
Okay. So is it the same content as the episodes that are audio only? Is it like behind the scenes?
So the concept was, because I love the bed, just the added atmospheric sounds is really what made me transport into and believe into a closer space. So we took the bed and we put it on a comedy stage and we toured the nation, putting that bed in their bedroom setup on a live comedy stage. They would come out to a live audience, and then with a celebrity guest and cast audience with questions that were pre-vetted by producers. And we would have an original 30-minute execution that we created intentionally to exhibit and put on air, different than the podcast episodes they were creating on a weekly basis.
Okay. Another question. I heard you throw out a couple of numbers. I think one was like $100,000 for a website. And the second one, I think, was like $3 million for developing an idea.
The $3 million was for the episode order. I'm doing 10 episodes of television. It's probably going to cost around $300,000 per episode. So 10 episodes times $300,000 per episode is a $3 million order. So I basically need to release $3 million of funds from MTV in order to create those 10 30-minute episodes of Man and Wife. The $100,000 investment was strictly for web development. Strictly for web development. And you ask me, that's a big number now. And that's not even inflated for 2006. That's literally the number we got, but it hadn't been done before. And a platform like MTV, especially when I was there, if we could be first and we could lead the conversation, that was really important to us. Now it's more about ownership of a conversation, insertion of our brand into an existing conversation to support an existing community. When I was at MTV, those communities weren't represented. And finding ways to get them represented and to get them into MTV was my job. So I had to be creative on how to get projects sold. I had to increase the visibility of producers because they were coming across as storytellers. You don't buy stories from storytellers. You buy stories from sources, right? Storytellers are Chicken Little. The sky is falling. The sky is falling. And eventually, as a source, the stories he tells are no longer valuable. I focused on creating sources at MTV Mostly, to be honest, because it was my job to go out and find talent that I did not understand. I did not understand the community, the language, the genre of music. There's so much that I was put into. And instead of trying to take it on myself, I would call the program director of Hot 95 and Power 105. And I would call the programming directors, and I would call these massive people coming from MTV again. I would call these massive people with an opportunity and open up that conversation. And I didn't realize this, but like finding the outliers, finding those connectors, like we talk about now in networking, how important that is. But I think what I did right was it was just never about the opportunity. It was always about the relationship, and those doors stayed open. And because those doors stayed open, we bought more shows, we bought more talent, and MTV franchise during my tenure at MTV, we went from one network to 70 internationally. We went from a national brand with a local product to a global brand with a local product. And how do that many different iterations of MTV deal with talent? Now creators, we might call them. For me back then, creators talent, it was Diddy, Ashton Kutcher. I learned to create content with like the top 1%. And sometimes there was no budget. Sometimes it was a great concept. And sometimes it was something that just needed to live on paper because the format spoke for itself. But I mentioned earlier with Wild 'N Out, and this is a special one for me because it's one of the 3 franchises that I helped launch that have certainly been the most successful and have created more stars than anything that I've worked on. Nick Cannon pitched Wild 'N Out, and it fell on deaf ears. And it was at a point in time where comedy wasn't necessarily rating well in television. And the problem was that when it was pitched, that's kind of what MTV put it in, is that's this bucket of like comedy as opposed to community. So Nick took that no and had every right to go to any network he wanted to pitch it, by the way. And instead of that, he was dating Christina Milian. It was Christmas break. They spent $15,000 renting out a comedy club to shoot a little bit of tape so they can show us what 2 celebrity captains look like and how we can talk about current interest and pop culture interest in a comedic tone. And then Nick came back, pushed play for us, and showed us what he had. And that's like what I mean by, look, I cast Housewives of New Jersey. Some of those auditions happened on Skype and Zoom back in the day. Other times I had to actually go to the house and do a physical tour of the home to show the network, what they were buying into. So the budgets change. And in terms of development, in terms of pitching, and in terms of securing an impression at a network, the budgets I've seen go from 0 to, I've seen people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars piloting full ideas versus, what I would recommend now is a 3-minute sizzle as opposed to what people felt like they needed to do back then. And that's why I'm deeply leaned into podcasting. I don't want to say every single network executive that I know, but most of them are on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and LinkedIn. And it's not on LinkedIn because they're all looking for new jobs because this industry is changing at a rapid pace, but they're looking for big stars and they're looking for content that already exists. And they're looking for something they can take it and make it to the next level, as opposed to like beginning of my career where it was sort of like fake it a little bit. And then when the cameras come around, then it can be real and we can really make it happen. But you don't make change that way when people only do actions in front of the camera. When you don't make change that way. So, but I've seen concepts on paper get greenlit, newspaper articles get sent in. And there was a show I did called Power Girls with Lizzie Grubman and her team of publicists. And we leveraged an article called Power Girls that was written in 1998. We leveraged that article in 2005 to create original programming. So I'm big on helping people create content. I like podcasting because it lets us lead with our thought oftentimes and not just a reaction to a conversation. And if we can create more content we feel called to make, not we feel like we have to make it because of a conversation that's already happening and we're trying to contribute to that conversation. That's not thought leadership. That's impact and that's community building. But thought leadership is changing the conversation entirely. And podcasting allows you to do that. I hear myself now better than I ever have before. And I think that has a lot to do with the podcasting piece. And I think way more than I have to speak, especially now that we have AI who does the thinking after we do the writing. So
you mentioned something about thought leadership.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was insightful. You basically said taking other people's content, giving our own spin on it is not thought leadership, but something else is. What's that thing that's truly thought leadership for you?
Structure. It's building space with your voice so you can make room for other people's voice. And that comes down to scheduling. So I think thought leadership is executed when I'm looking to build more thought leadership in a client. I will have them schedule live events every month. In Vegas, they have residencies. The residency is I know where that celebrity is. I know how to get to them. They don't have to move. I have to move to come to them. Building that rapport with your audience, building that trust with your audience, knowing that you're having a conversation today that will be supported tomorrow or a week from today or a month from today, whatever the consistency and sustainability allows for. That nurturing of conversation builds to credibility. Joining in on the conversation, look, there's comment ranking, and I can talk a little bit about thought leadership in the comments, though I truly believe that most leadership happens on our time. Like, think of artists in the 90s. They created albums that in a vacuum. They had no feedback from anybody, maybe some data from the label or whatever, but they created what they wanted, what they believed in, and then they put it out to the world and they asked for us to listen to it. I can relate to that now as a podcaster more than ever. And as long as I'm showing up with my original thoughts and I'm not just contributing to a conversation, but it's that thought leadership, it's that new sound of a familiar idea that opens up more doors and creates more opportunities.
Give us some example or two of how to know if it's thought leadership. Like when you're creating content, my listener is a podcast host, and I'm sure they want to be a thought leader and not just echoing something else. But how do they know if they're in that right line where they're not just copying stuff because they're part of the conversation, but it's their own spin? How do they know what that is? And maybe we could base it on one or two examples.
Yeah, sure. So one example would be, is your audience quoting you? There was this weird thing that happened in social media a decade ago where everyone created quote cards and it was kind of like faux pas and it was kind of like low entry content. But what it did brilliantly was put words on a shareable form of content that allowed us to be in the room when we weren't. And by creating quotable content and pieces of information that are shareable, that are talked about, that's thought leadership. Data that you own is thought leadership. So a very common practice I'll do for my clients is data that we need to create. So a survey or some type of information gathering tool. So there's data you own, a report that you own on that data. And then that report is published, but the data is owned. That report, you'll see, is quoted in press. Other people will talk about it in their convention speeches. It'll show up in slides and decks and things like that. And then larger resources will come to you for the data. The data is the source. The newsletter is the source on LinkedIn right now. So I was recently in the LinkedIn Podcast Academy. They picked 19 podcasters to be in this academy piloting program, and they gave us a lot of tools and access to LinkedIn. My number one takeaway from that experience was podcasts that have community that are dependent on knowledge and not updates. So not new episode. I'm not launching a newsletter only on or to support anything new. I have an ongoing conversation. I have ongoing facts. I have ongoing information that I'm inputting into an ongoing conversation as opposed to new episode, new episode, new episode. If I create the rhythm for my audience to continue the conversation in between episodes, which means they're commenting in my newsletter, they're sharing my newsletter because they find my community newsletter to be a source of information, not just a post. And I don't create stories. I create data and reports that need to be shared. So it makes you look good for sharing them. It makes you look good on LinkedIn for caring about this specific topic in the creator economy. And by leveraging that newsletter, I've grown my podcast audience way deeper. I mean, like to be able to show up once a month and do a live audio event that's recurring, constantly telling all of my listeners that that's where to find me. I think it builds the trust. I think that in television, the reason why we have set times is so that on appointment viewing TV, the reason like why that still happens is that we have the ability to experience something collectively together. And if podcasts are treated the same way, we have the opportunity to experience something together that we own, by the way, versus social media and that part. So leveraging the newsletter for me has been tremendous on LinkedIn. There are a lot of benefit. And anyone who follows your LinkedIn newsletter automatically follows you as well on LinkedIn. So more people will share my newsletter because it's a valuable source for their creator economy. And all of those follows are hitting my profile. It's a great way for me to grow and build my authority without having to post more frequently, without having to put out story or content that feel thin. And it doesn't make me post every single day.
Vinnie, one thing that you mentioned is it makes your audience deeper. You didn't say bigger, you said deeper.
Deeper.
Why did you say deeper?
Yeah, because I'm seeing it for sure. I'm getting more shares and I'm getting more support from my audience. If I were to look at the impact I've had, I've grown. Yes, I have grown, I would say maybe 30%, but the relationship I have with listeners, I don't know how to say this other than when I'm on LinkedIn Live and I hear someone's voice or I see someone's face or I see a profile that I recognize and we've never met, that's like beauty to me. That's when people are showing up. They're putting out energy. They're really supporting the content. I think that's important. I got this whole weird energy around repurposing content. People are reactive to the content they create. They create content and then they're actually surprised that they have to like promote it or market it or put it out on social. Like they're like, I have to repurpose, something that I created. And television, I'm given a 30-minute show, 7 30-second commercials, 2 15-second spots. I have a list of content that I need because in TV, I have locations and distributions for all of those. So there's a need. I'm working backwards from a quota. In podcasting, we tend to not work backwards from a quota. We tend to create space as opposed to fill space. So by creating deeper relationships with my audience, I've been able to better understand who's going to support my content. And now when I drop content, whether it's a newsletter, an episode, or a short, I have people who are waiting to support the content as opposed to me wondering who's going to support it. And they're waiting for me because I'm working backwards from a quota. Like I'm delivering high value content that I know they want and need. And it's not just people, it's businesses as well. And it's niche art accounts and it's niche pop culture accounts on Instagram. It's people who have a daily need to post content that I know I can reach out to and work backwards because they have a need of content. And if I show them as a source, not as a storyteller, I'm not pitching you one social media thing to help me out with. I'm pitching you Christina Milian and Mandy Moore and like the greatest year, the golden decade of MTV is what I can bring to the table as a source.
So who is your audience? Who is your perfect listener of your podcast?
Yeah, the perfect listener of my podcast is millennials to Gen X, people who have a fascination for TV and understanding, probably grew up watching TV, are looking to step into new media as well. I'm very nurturing, and most of my one-on-ones come from the TV landscape, whether they're top celebrities or producers or journalists that are no longer at the news stations anymore. And MTV News isn't around anymore. So there's a lot of old media that's shutting down. And as people prepare to adapt for this new media, I'm in a good position to help them figure out the opportunities, the platforms and places where they can stand out. Look, we can be invited, and most of the platforms will just take about just about anybody, right? Because it's about quantity of content and eyeballs, and it's that game. If I can help people who are creators or have a creative aptitude to solve an issue, someone who knows that by creating a feeling, an energy, a mantra, a conversation, and has an audience that can impact and change, those are my people. People who want to be famous and they don't want to leverage it for the betterment of mankind. They just want to be famous. They just want to be on TV. You're just meeting me too late because I did that in the 90s and early 2000s already. And the difference now is the responsibility we have in public media and in social media to make change. I can save people hundreds of thousands of dollars in development because they're developing projects that can be sold. So many people create projects that have no buyer out there. And the number one way a show doesn't get made is if there's no audience or platform that it's targeting. And then again, it's the segmentation of episodes. I'm really big on long form content. I look at the Today Show and I look at the late night show with Jimmy Fallon. There's an hour long show, but in it is the tiny little office segment. And that tiny little office segment, which is really a digital first segment, is dropped and recorded in broadcast to give it maximum visibility and then put in social media to give it that shareability. And visibility without shareability does not lead to discoverability. It leads to more visibility. It's like, there's that
Say it again. Say it again. Let it stick.
Well, visibility with no shareability. If we're not talking about it, I'm not sharing it. I don't care about it, but I just see it everywhere. I'm not talking about it and it's not getting discovered. Think about Mariah Carey on Thanksgiving. The Christmas song is out. Everyone's talking about it. A week later, no one talks about it because everyone's heard it and it's no longer new news. That visibility is no longer shareable. And it's the ego that wants to share things, right? I found something that I think my people, my team, my family, my colleagues will benefit from. So I get to bring this to them. Like there's an ego that's searching for value that I can bring to my people. That's discoverability equals shareability times visibility. If there's no shareability, it falls into two categories, entertainment or education, right? Because entertainment, it's really about watching the segments so you get the ads in the middle or the lower thirds. So if it's entertainment, on these platforms, the goal is advertising. And if it's education, the goal is consumption. The goal is, I don't want you to click on anything. I want you to take it and move it in. I think that's why a lot of us are fed up with like LinkedIn groups and things like that, where there's ads and distractions and just additional energy other than the focus to actually accomplish the task at hand.
I got two more questions for you. Sure. The first one is, why is the title, I Have a Podcast? We're going to get that after the break. But I'm curious, why did you make that the title? And then the second thing is just the best advice that you would have for a brand new podcaster, somebody who's podcasting, they want it to be shareable and they want it to happen organically. They want to figure this out, but they haven't done it on their own. What do they need to change? So we'll be right back. Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, growyourshow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show. We're back with Vinnie Potestivo, and we are talking about getting your brand out in front of people. And branding, I think, is quite important. He has a podcast. It's called I Have a Podcast, and it's registered trademark. And I'm curious, why did you name it that? Is it for your avatar? Is there something behind it? Or is it just you wanted to be proud of yourself that you finally got your podcast?
To be blunt and honest, I'm proud that I own intellectual property.
Okay.
And most of the people I work with don't own the projects that we created. Also, you're talking to the guy who did the Osbournes and Run's House and the Ashley Simpson show. I could be pretty literal at times. I could have leaned on idioms. I love idioms too. So taking something that's familiar and giving it a new twinge. I did a show on Lifetime called Questions of Love. You think you've heard it before, but you haven't. It's a new concept. The truth is I want people to be inspired by what I have. Look, I have a great career and none of that content I own. And I've been a part of tremendous franchises and successes and creativity and failures. Got to point that out too. But most of my clients come to me saying, I saw you have a podcast and I want one too. Also, we say it. People said punked. The people said Yo Mama. We didn't come up with Yo Mama on MTV as a TV show name if it weren't for what we were saying. And I look at the colloquialisms. I look at the language that we're using, that we're connecting with, that also separates us. And that's why it's clunky by design. I Have a Podcast is trackable. I did register it, by the way, for a couple of $100. So I highly recommend registering a trademark that you can really lean into. And then I made it, I Have a Podcast on TV and I Have a Podcast on the radio. So I can be really clunky with it. So you can track what I'm doing with it. Because if I can do it, so can you. These are networking opportunities that have come my way more so than something I did 20 years ago or 5 years ago in TV that did right. It's modern networking that really helped me do that.
Okay. What does the listener need to know if they want a successful thought leadership platform?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, it's self-confidence. It's really got to start with self-confidence. If it doesn't start with self-confidence, you don't see the red flags. You question your value. It drives me crazy when people say, oh, how do I create content that's valuable? And I say, you don't. You are the valuable. The message, a lot of us have a very similar message, by the way, about the environment, about politics, about family, about holidays. But it's us, the individuals, that make our message fascinating and unique. And that relies on self-confidence. For thought leadership, if you're going to get out there and say something before anybody else has, you need to have that confidence. to start a trend, to see a trend and spot a trend and call that trend, even if as that trend is happening. It's self-confidence. It's self-confidence to stay in it, to show up in a space where you belong. And let me remind you, I came from TV where like a couple of people own the TV industry. We, the creators of podcasting, own, like it's our episodes every single day that make this industry bigger. So for all y'all who hear podcasting is oversaturated, let me tell you something. Who told you that? The TV people? Magazine people? I'd be scared too if I was coming from their perspective. I heard the same thing in reality TV in the late 90s. Are you crazy? This is never going to pick up. Every single network and platform has documentary, real life opportunities now for people to share their stories. You have to have confidence to stand up for a concept that you believe in. And look, time is a weirdo. I blame everything on time. My favorite word in the entire world is yet. Yet. I haven't made it yet. I didn't win my Emmy yet. And then I realized I didn't win an Emmy because I've never been nominated. And I've never been nominated because I never applied. I never paid the fee that it takes to be considered. And Beyonce pays for every single one of her Grammy nominations, and artists pay for every single one of their Oscars and Tonys. There's no difference. And when I realized I was making that decision, to me, again, self-confidence. I'm in an interview and I saw that my resolution was not high quality. The self-confidence kicked in me. I said, I'm making a decision to make me 480, 720, not even HD. I'm making a decision to have bad lighting. I'm making a decision not to have fancy audio uplighting, because like nothing makes you look more legit than like uplighting in podcasting. And these are self-confident moves that made me say, I want to show up in my own best light. Because what I don't need is a casting director from the 90s to tap me on my shoulder to tell me that this is my moment. What I do need is to be in the right place, right time, right people, saying the right thing so that when you find me, you make this opportunity happen. And that's what we get to do. That's how we get to show up now. Whether you're a business leader, a college student, a 7-year-old, you identify as a creative, you identify as talent or don't. We have the ability now to create content and make those creative opportunities happen. And in that ownership of that comes authority.
Good stuff, Vinnie. Thank you for jumping on the podcast. I appreciate you. A lot of interesting stuff. Some of my takeaways and things that I want to bring to the audience that I thought was interesting is our budget. Like a lot of us don't see podcasting needing a budget. Okay. So like we look at podcasting, we're thinking to ourselves, all right, I can do this like bootstrap. I can do this really, really, really inexpensively. But you talked about that $100,000 website back in 2006. You talked about the $3 million in development. And it just makes me think, and I hope the listener as well, like we should be finding a way to front and invest in our podcast, like put a good amount in it in the beginning to make sure that it's going to long last. And I could tell that you were probably talking about marketing was important because you kept saying like, some of us, we push record and we expect everything else to just happen automatically. But like for you in TV, you had a certain number of 30-second ads, 15-second spots, 1-minute spots that you had intentionally to do marketing. I think it's really interesting. Additionally, talking about that we want to have our audience quoting us. I think your quote was, this is me quoting you now. Is your audience quoting you? Is your audience quoting you? That's how you know if you've got a thought leadership platform. And so for me, I actually do that intentionally, which I never thought it the way that you explain it. I just think about it like, okay, this is a good way for my listener to understand it. So I make up stories like it's a story that my listener probably has heard. You probably haven't, but it's a story about this cave person that develops fire and figures out fire, and then he draws his line in the sand. And these are things that some people are quoting me for. Some people are quoting me from some of the ways that I express things. Although I'm probably saying something similar to many other people, I'm using different stories. And is your audience quoting you? I want to make sure my audience is quoting me. And I think that our listeners should be also considering that as well. So really good tip there. Talking about your relationship with your audience being way deeper. Not necessarily saying that the audience got bigger. You mentioned they got 30% bigger, but how the relationships got deeper. And it was because you don't just have a podcast, you've got a place on LinkedIn, or you've got a place on Facebook, or you've got a newsletter. that you're connecting with your audience there. And that builds trust, as you said, by having those relationships deeper, not necessarily wider, but deeper. A mile wide and an inch deep, or a mile deep and an inch wide. It's really going down and having those relationships with those people that follow you and follow your content. I love that. I've got confidence being the top thing that you could share with the listener who is a podcaster who wants to have a true thought leadership platform. As you stated, we're not going to get anywhere without having that confidence within ourselves. Without having that confidence, we're not going to shine. We're not going to have those opinions. We're not going to be willing to share them. We're going to be timid. We're going to be holding back. And with the confidence allows us to be, as you said, the top number one thing if we want to have a thought leadership platform. So great stuff. I appreciate you jumping on. I know we're getting short on time. So let me just say to the listener real quick, to the listener, every other episode is a solo episode. And I've got a solo episode that I recorded. And I'm actually been quite excited about my recent solo episodes. I've been really, really excited. If you've been listening in, you could probably tell that I'm stoked about them. I'm loving that I'm being able to get those 5 to 10, sometimes 15-minute episodes just packed with a punch that I think you need to know, because I took the time to figure that out, to find out what is my listener asking for? What do new podcasters need? And the next episode is one of those. I'll see you there. By the way, one way to ensure that you don't miss out on great content that we're producing on a regular basis is to make sure you're subscribed to the show. You need to be subscribed or following the Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to it in order not to miss all of that. And before I let you go, I need to mention, because a lot of people are asking, do you help? Can you help me with this? And the answer is yes. My company actually does it. It's called Grow Your Show. And you can find that at growyourshow.com. Our clients, they call us the easy button for podcaster, because they simply have to record their episode. And they know that every single thing else is done for them. We sweat the hard stuff so you can be the star of your show. And if you would like help to make sure that we're editing and publishing and promoting and doing your social media, it's all in one place. And I think it's pretty affordable. You'll have to take a look for yourself. Just go to growyourshow.com and check us out. And by the way, I'll see you on the next episode.